Hello and welcome to the Cardiac Cats YouTube channel. I'm your host, Jacob Shorba, and today we're going to be recording our final video before free agency begins on Monday, talking about who I think the Jaguars will end up signing in free agency. Now, I want you guys to understand that there is a ton of projection in this video. Very good chance that, honestly, as sad as it would be, there might not be a single player I project that gets signed to the team. It's hard to predict. There's 32 teams, and there's even a name in here that we don't even know if he's going to be out there. So I just want to give you guys my thoughts on what I think will happen, whether or not it's super likely. There's so many outcomes that there's just very rarely going to be a situation where something's got more than a 50% chance of happening in the best case scenario. But I will tell you one thing. One of these guys on the thumbnail, I think they will be in Jacksonville, and it really just depends on how the negotiations end up going in free agency. But let's start on the offensive side of the ball. With our first one, it's Kendrick Bourne. And so I have to first talk about why the Jaguars target Kendrick Bourne, why I think they will. I think that Calvin Ridley is going to walk in free agency. I think that's incredibly likely. I think he's going to get a lot of big offers. He's the clear wide receiver one on the market. And while I don't know how crazy the market's going to be for everyone else necessarily, I do know that for Ridley, there's going to be a lot of teams that are going to want him, that have more money, and will probably value him more as a player. I don't know if Trent Baalke will go out and outbid those teams straight up and pay him like a massive $25 million APY deal or anything like that. I really don't know if he goes to that extent, and he might. I mean, that's totally possible that we just throw him an absolute crap ton of money because he might just want to keep him that bad. But I think realistically that it's very similar to Juwan Taylor's situation. Teams start outbidding the Jaguars, and quickly they get priced out of range. And so this really changes a lot. I want to explain why. And you've heard it a little bit on the channel, but I want to put it in here so to explain some of the signings. If Calvin Ridley walks, he will almost undoubtedly net the Jaguars a potential third-round compensatory pick. Now, why this is important is because you only keep that if your spending is limited. So you have to sign only so many players, depending on how many people depart your team as CFAs, compensatory free agents, and you're limited to how big of contracts you can hand out. And so the question, if Calvin Ridley walks, when you're talking about a player like Danielle Hunter, you're asking yourself, is it worth giving up that third round pick to go get Danielle Hunter? Because that's your compensation instead of the third rounder. So then you got to play another game. And it really changes a ton for Jacksonville, I think, depending on what happens with Calvin Ridley. And realistically, I think there's another team out there that wants him more, that has a lot more money, that pays him a crap ton of money, and he ends up leaving Jacksonville. So talking about offense, how does this change things? Well, I think it only changes one thing on offense, and that's obviously, what receiver do you target? I've heard a lot of stuff about Gabe Davis. That's one that's got a lot of smoke to it right now. But I do think that the way things start out, I think Gabe Davis is maybe the second or third receiver who's getting bid on, that a lot of teams are going to focus on him. And there's legitimately the chance that before Jacksonville even knows that they lose Calvin Ridley, Gabe Davis could be signed to another team that quick. Because, well, he's really, when you look at the receivers, probably the top option as far as a deep threat, someone who can win down the field. Teams will look at him and probably say, what if we could get the best side out of him all the time? You know, and teams believe that they can do that they're just going to coach better. And so as much as the Jaguars have connections, they have to focus on Calvin Ridley. And I could see a scenario where by the time that they figure out that Ridley's not coming back, that they may not be able to pivot to Gabe Davis. Because Gabe Davis might be signed by another team at that point. And if it's official, it's official. So I think what happens, I think they go after Ridley. I think he walks. I think Davis is off the market. And I think they end up going to a former target of theirs that I've talked about a lot on the channel, that being Kendrick Bourne from the New England Patriots. And I'll tell you this, as far as backups, like not backups in the sense of like you're a backup on the field or anything, but backup options for Calvin Ridley. This is probably my favorite one for the Jaguars, and I think it could happen because this is a player they've been interested in before. They know him pretty well. I think he's going to be someone on their radar, and he obviously, based off this money, would be a lot more affordable of a player. And he's a reliable player. So Bourne has gotten better every single year. And I think this Jaguars offense, while you want to have that elite wide receiver one, it can function if you have separators, if you have guys that can be reliable. And I think the Jaguars want to believe that Christian Kirk is that, first of all, which we know that. I don't think there's much debate there. I think they want to believe Zay Jones can be that again, that he's going to get back to form. I think he's safe. And you bring in Kendrick Bourne, you might have a really solid receiving core, even though you don't have a wide receiver one. So I think they look at it like that. Bourne comes in on a 2-year deal, probably 1 year guaranteed. And then you have a lot of flexibility in the coming years. You can go draft someone still, but it locks down the position after you lose a big-time player. And this is part of changing the focus, right? If you lose Ridley, now you got to think about the third-round pick, and you got to think about who you're going to spend money on. So I think Bourne is one of those players that makes a lot of sense for the Jaguars. Now, next one I've got on my list, Garrett Bradbury. This is one that would not count as a CFA. And it's also a projection. Because right now, Garrett Bradbury is still under contract with the Vikings. But there's a lot of talk right now that he gets cut. And the way I see it, I think the Jaguars struggle to compete with other teams on the market this year. I think other teams are willing to outbid them. I don't think Trent Baalke wants to ideally spend a bunch. And you look at like Mitch Morse, well, he would be a pretty good player. I think you're looking at probably 6 to 7 million to sign him. And so I don't know if Jacksonville wants that. And if you have Bradbury hit the market, it's another Minnesota player that Rauscher's worked with. You know that Ezra Cleveland did very well when he was playing next to Bradbury, which is a chief concern. They obviously feel like center is the main issue on the offensive line. You know that one of the players would be significantly better working next to Bradbury, and you think that Scherf would be better as well. So it's a cheap signing. It's a veteran signing. It brings in someone to compete, and you do it for 1 year, and then you can evaluate from there how you feel about Luke Fortner, although as fans and people who are trying to be unbiased the best we can and not attached to players, we know that Luke Fortner is probably not the long-term solution to the Jaguars. But the team, I don't know if they're there. So Garrett Bradbury would be a logical person to keep your eyes on for the offensive line. Now, on the defensive side of the ball, this is where it gets interesting, because this is where the Calvin Ridley comp pick comes into factor. I think that the Jaguars are going to end up getting Marcus Davenport. And I think ideally for them, they're going to target Danielle Hunter. And I said in the last video I thought they would actually sign him. But if Calvin Ridley walks, that's a huge impact in that. Because there's a few factors that go against the Jaguars to start. One is that you're going to have teams like Chicago, like Washington, that have way more resources, that are going to clearly have a need at pass rusher. They're probably going to go out and bid a crap ton of money on a player like Danielle Hunter. And then you got to think, in the middle of this, you're negotiating with Josh Allen. We're hearing more stuff now about them actually being close to a deal. So I'm really excited about that. I'll tell you that. If they come to a deal, I'm going to feel a lot better as a fan, because I was just worried about what they actually plan there, just based off the things we've heard for a year. But if Josh Allen is about to get extended, right, and that might happen before free agency, it might happen before this video even goes up for all I know. But now you've got a ton of money invested there. I don't know if they want to do that again with Hunter. And you're going to probably get outbid. And if you sign Hunter, now you're giving up that third-round compensatory pick. So why not go after a player like Marcus Davenport? I think would be a logical signing for the Jaguars. So Davenport, just to talk about him, he's not an outside linebacker. He's more of a defensive end. So he's going to play defensive end, your 4-3 fronts, and your 3-4 fronts. So hand the dirt. That's clearly a need for the Jaguars. I think Dewan Smoot walks. You're going to get a comp pick out of that. That'll get canceled out by this move. But Marcus Davenport, he's worked with Nielsen. He was a very good player under Nielsen, and he struggled in Minnesota really just because of injury. I mean, I don't think he was a bad player there. He just signed a deal, and it was 1 year, prove it, and he didn't have a good year. And so that's going to happen when you're not on the field. And the Jaguars are a team that's probably set up to benefit from that, because now Davenport has to take another short-term deal. He has to take a prove-it deal, and it's going to be even less than what it was before. I mean, this is half the value, and that is where it's projected right now. So I think Davenport makes a lot of sense as the backup option. I think he could be out there for a while as well. He could be a player that you could see sign maybe in May. Early May after the draft, not a CFA at that point. It's possible that's the case with Davenport, and that's a really good outcome for the Jaguars, because then that helps you even further in making sure that you get the third rounder from Calvin Ridley, which will become a focus if Ridley walks and they aren't just that set on one player. Maybe they go in on Chris Jones and, they're like, screw it. I don't think that'll happen. I think Chris Jones will probably fold and go back to Kansas City based off how he's negotiated things over the last year. But this would be one of those players. Another player that I think comes in with connections to Ryan Nielsen, and another one that could potentially sign after the draft happens and save you another one of those CFA selections, Jeff Okudah from the Atlanta Falcons. You're going to hear him a lot, and you won't hear him if he doesn't sign with Jacksonville anymore, but I think he's going to. I think this is the most logical person to bring in. Ryan Nielsen had a lot of good things to say about him. Had one of his best years as a pro as well. He is a player that his stock was starting to finally turn around, and he might be a player that's just better this year. He might just continually improve, and it'd be a smart place for him to go. Like if I'm Jeff Okudah, and I'm thinking about where I want to play, and I know that I just had my best year under Ryan Nielsen. I know they need an outside cornerback. I know there's not tons of competition there. I'm going to Jacksonville. Like, even if I have to take a little bit of a pay cut, I'm considering that. And I don't know if he'll have to take a pay cut necessarily, but Jeff Okudah, really smart player for the Jaguars to bring in, and another one that could be very late in the process. And I'll have to encourage you guys, as much as it sucks to not know what the team is going to do, we have to give them time to work things out with some of these positions, because sometimes there is a plan that just takes a while to implement. For example, I don't really think that the offensive line, the way they're dealing with things, is the best way, right? I think they need to reset and get some new faces. But I can understand the idea of renegotiating with your players that are big contracts, making them take pay cuts. You force them to earn it. They could be comp picks the next year if they don't return. And you go get a center, which is your biggest need. I can understand why they're doing that, even if I don't think it's going to work. And so I think I think you can understand why they would do that, and you have to give them time to work it out and acknowledge that that's probably happening behind the scenes. And I think we have a pretty clear hint towards that, hearing that Brandon Scherff's going to take a pay cut. I don't think Trent Baalke made it absolutely abundantly clear that Cam Robinson's returning on his contract as it is. I think what he said was that, hey, he's on the roster, but we are in negotiations with all these players. Go listen to what he said again, because it was not just one thing. He followed it up on his own talking about negotiations. There's only one reason he's mentioning that, right? And it's because he's talking to him about it. So, cornerback, pass rusher, these are positions that we might take a little bit of time to resolve. I don't think they go out first week and have Okudah and Davenport signed, but they might be ones you get after the draft or close to the draft, depending on what the market looks like. But these are two players that are really smart signings, because you might be able to get them to wait until that point, because They got faces they can trust here. They've got guys they've worked with before. So I really like the idea of both those players as cheap, potentially impact signings, really good fits for the Jaguars, people that know how this team is going to be run and can do a very good job on it coming in early in the season. So I think they're players the Jaguars look at. They have to be on their radar. I mean, you think about the connections they have to them. You think about how they're bringing in Mitch Morse for a visit immediately with Chad Hall having come from Buffalo. There's reasons for this to believe this stuff. Ezra Cleveland getting traded from Minnesota after Phil Rauscher was the OO coach when he got drafted. We've seen this with Jacksonville. So Davenport and Okudah, two players I do think make their way down to Jacksonville, two that I'm probably the most confident in on this list. But the final one, an interesting one as well, especially since his friend will be departing while he comes in if this was the scenario. And that's C.J. Gardner-Johnson. I think this could legit happen for the Jaguars. And we haven't heard rumors necessarily around it, but it fits the bill. Nielsen wants aggressive players. He wants guys who are going to force turnovers. That's what Gardner-Johnson does. And whether or not they see Antonio Johnson, first of all, as a starter or as a backup, we'll see which one it is. I hope it's a starter. He deserves a start. But Johnson has played cornerback, slot cornerback that is, and safety. So Gardner-Johnson could come in and easily fill in some snaps. We also consider how Baalke likes to do his deals. And we know that Baalke generally wants to go after players that he can't lose on. He can't sign them and then look like a fool. And you take out 2022 when you talk about that with free agency, right? Because I think there's probably a pretty strong argument they just had to go out and spend a ton of money that year for him to save his job. There might have been a lot of pressure on him for all we know. So I don't think that's really who Baalke usually is. I think that's who he had to become that offseason. And we saw last year, we see through his trades, this is not the way he wants to operate. He wants to get the effective deals where worst case scenario is, oh, well, minor loss, who cares? So C.J. Gardner-Johnson, being a very good player, came to Detroit, had to take a one-year deal already because the market wasn't there, gets hurt early in the year. He's going to hit the market again as it is now. It's a logical signing, right? Fits the scheme, everything you want. Now you've got your secondary filled out. And I think the secondary is going to be a major focus for this team because you think about your releases. You lost the starter in Rayshawn Jenkins. You lost the starter in Darius Williams. These snaps have to be replicated by someone. And you even throw in Trey Herndon as the other one because he wouldn't be coming back in this scenario, and I don't think he does come back. So this is another player that I think comes to Jacksonville. And those are my 5 guys. I'm sure we'll get some smaller contracts, right? I'm sure we'll get players like maybe Shaquille Quarterman coming back. I could throw them out there, but I think that's kind of too small of a topic to discuss at this point, or it'd just be a really long video. So these are the 5 players I think they target. It's usually about that amount we see. I think everything gets dictated by what happens with Calvin Ridley. Because I'll tell you this. If Calvin Ridley gets signed by the Jaguars, there's not as much reason for them to back off of a player like Danielle Hunter. If they still want him, go out and get him. They can go out and spend more money then because nothing's on the line as far as draft picks. You lose Ridley. If you let him walk, then you have to avoid spending money if you want to get a single thing out of it. Otherwise, it's all for nothing. So that's really bad. I mean, it's not a good thing to have on your resume if you make that kind of trade and you couldn't get anything out of it when you had the option there to just franchise tag him, get your stupid deal done with Josh Allen, which we're figuring out now was supposed to be $30 million a year, and they couldn't accept that. And that's crazy to me because he's a $30 million a year player, and he will not be the highest paid player or the second highest paid player for that long because other players are going to get deals here soon. And you got to re-sign them. You're not going to keep your job if you don't do that. So it's kind of a mess. I think so many things are tied up to what happens with Calvin Ridley, and we could have drastically different outcomes for free agency. So those are my final thoughts before we head into it. I'm planning right now, ideally, to have a live stream on Monday night. We'll see if that happens. It kind of depends, too, with how many signings actually take place. And there should be stuff to talk about, right? Because Calvin Ridley will probably be signed to a team by the time we stream. So ideally, I'll have that on Monday. You guys can come in and talk. We can either rant about it or feel good about it, depending on what happens. But that's all I've got for you. Let me know what you think. Let me know players that you think will sign in Jacksonville, why you think they'll sign in Jacksonville, and who you want them to try to go sign. I'd love to hear it. So that's what I've got. Hope you have a great rest of your day. And finally, go Jags.